Imagine being told over and over that a system has finally been fixed, that this time it will be kinder, smarter, more humane, that all the ugly failures you've seen in history weren't real socialism, or weren't done correctly, or were sabotaged by someone else. Now imagine hearing the same sales pitch while your grocery bill climbs, your rent feels like a second mortgage, your paycheck buys less, and every problem suddenly has the same proposed solution. More government control, more spending, more planning, more experts, more power concentrated at the top. That's the moment we're in right now, and that's why this matters, because the most dangerous lies aren't the ones shouted by extremists. The most dangerous lies are the ones repeated calmly on television, taught politely in classrooms, and printed nicely in policy papers until they feel like common sense. And tonight, I want to do something that modern politics tries to prevent. I want to take these claims apart, one by one, with logic, with incentives, and with the hard memory of what happened to real human beings when these ideas moved from speeches into law. The title of this talk is not a metaphor, it's a warning. The lies of socialism that sank countries and now threaten the United States. You might think, that sounds dramatic. Good, it should. Because the path to decline is rarely a single event. It's usually a slow normalization of bad ideas, a gradual trade of freedom for promises, a sequence of small compromises that feel compassionate in the moment and end up cruel in the long run. Socialism doesn't usually arrive with a marching band that says, "Hello, we're here to remove your choices." It arrives wearing a mask of fairness. It arrives as an emergency measure. It arrives as a temporary program. It arrives as a reasonable restriction. It arrives by redefining words, turning rights into entitlements, turning profit into theft, turning inequality into injustice, turning control into protection. And then, one day people wake up and realize the economy they relied on is no longer an economy that rewards value. It's an economy that rewards proximity to power. Now, let me be clear before we go any further. This is not an attack on compassion. It's not an attack on helping the poor, or caring about workers, or wanting a society where families can thrive. If anything, it's the opposite. It's a defense of the only system that has repeatedly created mass prosperity for ordinary people. A system where free individuals can trade, compete, innovate, save, invest, and build without needing permission from a central authority. The reason I'm focusing on socialism is simple. Socialism makes promises it cannot keep. And when those promises fail, it doesn't admit failure. It demands more power. That's the pattern. That is the trap. And if you understand the lies early, you can recognize the pattern before it becomes your life. Let's begin with the first lie, the one that sits underneath everything else. The lie that the problem is the system, not incentives. Socialism sells itself as a moral upgrade, as if human behavior changes the moment the government changes the rules. In the socialist story, the state will manage resources for the people, and selfishness will fade, and cooperation will replace greed. But the real world does not run on speeches. It runs on incentives. If you reward something, you get more of it. If you punish something, you get less of it. If you pay people whether they produce or not, you get less production. If you make failure someone else's problem, you get more failure. If you detach decisions from consequences, you get careless decisions. This isn't ideology, this is gravity. In a market, profit is not just money. Profit is information. It's a signal that resources were used in a way people value more than the alternatives. Loss is also information. It's a signal that resources were wasted relative to what people want. Socialism tries to silence these signals and replace them with committees. But committees don't feel losses the way a business owner does. A committee doesn't go bankrupt. A committee doesn't lose its home because it made bad forecasts. A committee doesn't feel the pain directly, so it has no natural discipline. When the state makes mistakes, it doesn't learn like a business forced to adapt. It expands the budget, blames sabotage, and asks for more authority. That's how you get an economy that becomes permanently under reform, permanently in transition, permanently one new plan away from success that never arrives. And the most brutal part is this. Socialism doesn't eliminate selfishness, it relocates it. It moves selfishness from the marketplace, where you have to serve others to get paid, into politics, where you can win by manipulating power. In a free market, if you want to get rich, you usually have to create value for someone else. In a socialist system, the fastest path to wealth is to get close to the people who control permits, contracts, quotas, licenses, and approvals. That's how you get corruption that feels systemic, because it is. Now, the second lie, and this one is the crowd favorite. Socialism is just capitalism with a bigger safety net. This is where definitions get weaponized. People are shown successful countries with markets, private property, entrepreneurship, trade, prices, competition, and then told, see, that's socialism. But if a country has strong property rights, free enterprise, and market pricing, it is not socialist. It may have welfare programs, it may have regulations, it may have high taxes, but the engine of its prosperity is still capitalism, the freedom to produce and trade. Socialism is not when the government does stuff. Socialism is when the state controls the means of production, or when the state increasingly replaces voluntary exchange with centralized allocation. It's about who owns, who decides, and who bears the consequences. Here's why that distinction matters. You can have a market economy with a social safety net and still remain a market economy if the core mechanisms of prices, competition, and private ownership are intact. But the minute you treat the economy like a machine to be steered by political will, choosing winners and losers, setting prices, controlling industries, forcing outcomes, you're no longer just helping. You're overriding the feedback system that prevents massive waste. And that's the step countries take right before stagnation becomes permanent. And you can see this progression. It rarely starts with total nationalization. It starts with temporary controls. A cap here, a mandate there, a subsidy for this group, a penalty for that group. It starts with the belief that politicians can fix the market like a mechanic fixes a car. But the economy is not a car. It's millions of people making decisions with information that no central planner can fully possess. When you override that, you don't create justice. You create shortages, black markets, favoritism, and collapse. Now, the third lie, profit is theft. This lie is emotionally powerful because it targets resentment. It tells people, you are not struggling because your choices were wrong or because reality is hard. You are struggling because someone else is stealing from you. And yes, there are real cases of corruption and exploitation, but profit itself is not theft. Profit is what happens when you create something people willingly pay for because it improves their lives. It is the reward for coordinating resources, labor, capital, knowledge, risk, into something useful. If profit were theft, then every time you buy a product you like, you would be a victim. But you aren't a victim when you voluntarily exchange money for value. You're choosing. That choice is dignity. Socialist rhetoric tries to turn voluntary exchange into moral crime so that it can justify force. Because if profit is theft, then taking property is justice. If business owners are exploiters, then seizing their assets is liberation. But once you declare profit immoral, you destroy the incentive to build, expand, hire, and risk. The entrepreneur stops seeing opportunity and starts seeing danger. The investor stops funding new ideas and starts hiding capital. The skilled worker stops working overtime and starts working the minimum, and the country begins to bleed competence. Here's what socialists never say out loud. If you remove profit, you don't remove costs. You don't remove scarcity. You don't remove trade-offs. You just make them invisible. And when costs become invisible, they become uncontrolled. The question is never, will we pay? The question is always, how will we pay and who will decide? Under socialism, you still pay. You just pay through shortages, rationing, inflation, and lost opportunity. Which brings us to the fourth lie. The government can give you free stuff. This is the lie that sinks nations faster than any slogan. Because it feels kind, it feels humane, it feels like progress, and it is economically illiterate. The government does not produce wealth. It can only take wealth from somewhere else, through taxes, borrowing, or printing money. Taxes are obvious. Borrowing is delayed taxation. Printing is hidden taxation through inflation. There is no fourth option. When a government promises benefits without matching production, it is promising consumption without creation. That is not generosity. That is a mathematical impossibility. You can only redistribute what exists. And the more you punish the act of creating, the less exists to redistribute. That's why socialism eventually becomes a war on the productive. And when the productive leave, hide, reduce effort, or stop innovating, the system collapses into desperation. Look at the historical pattern. Many countries that moved towards socialist policies didn't collapse because they ran out of ideas. They collapsed because they ran out of other people's money. They expanded programs faster than productivity. They treated debt like a political tool. They used central banks as piggy banks. For a while, it looked fine because the damage had a delay. But reality always collects its bill. And that is how inflation becomes the quiet partner of socialist policy. If you can't tax enough and you can't borrow forever, you print, you dilute the currency, you make everyone poorer without holding a vote. Inflation is not just a rise in prices, it is a collapse in purchasing power. It is a silent transfer of wealth from savers and wage earners to debtors and the state. And historically, governments choose inflation because it's politically easier than honesty. It's easier than saying, we promise too much. It's easier than cutting spending. It's easier than reforming entitlements. So they inflate, and they blame businesses, and they blame supply chains, and they blame greed, and they blame anything except the one institution that creates currency, the state. Now the fifth lie, central planning is more efficient than the market. This is the lie that sounds smart to people who love charts and hate messiness. Planning feels orderly, it feels scientific, it feels moral, but it's a fantasy. No central planner can collect the real-time, localized, constantly changing information embedded in millions of individual decisions. Prices are not just numbers. They are compressed knowledge, signals about scarcity, demand, alternatives, preferences, costs, and risk. When you manipulate prices, you manipulate reality. And when you manipulate reality long enough, reality punches back. That's why socialist economies struggle with shortages and surpluses simultaneously. They can have empty shelves and wasted warehouses at the same time. They can have too much of what nobody wants and not enough of what everybody needs. Because without price signals, production becomes guesswork, and guesswork at the scale of a nation becomes tragedy. Think about something as simple as bread. In a market, if bread becomes scarce, the price rises. That signals bakers to bake more, farmers to plant more, distributors to prioritize supply, and consumers to conserve. It's not perfect, but it adapts. In a planned system, the government often caps the price to make bread affordable. It feels compassionate until bakers can't cover costs and stop producing, and then bread disappears. Then the government responds not by admitting the cap caused the shortage, but by blaming hoarders and punishing sellers. And now you've created a black market. The price still rises in reality, but now it rises illegally. And the poor, who were supposed to be protected, end up paying the highest price of all. They pay in time, scarcity, and humiliation. This is why price controls are the emergency lever of failing socialist systems. When inflation rises because of money printing, politicians fear voter anger, so they cap prices, they freeze wages, they impose fairness, and the result is always the same: shortages, rationing, corruption, and decline. History isn't ambiguous here, it's repetitive. Now the sixth lie, socialism means more freedom. This lie is sneaky because it redefines freedom. It says freedom is freedom from discomfort, freedom from risk, freedom from inequality, freedom from responsibility. But real freedom is freedom to act, freedom to choose, to trade, to speak, to own, to build, to fail, to try again. And the moment the state becomes responsible for providing outcomes, it must control inputs. If the government promises everyone housing, it must control construction, rent, zoning, materials, labor, financing, and allocation. If it promises everyone healthcare, it must control prices, wages, supply, and access. If it promises jobs, it must control hiring, wages, industries, and investment. You cannot have the state guaranteeing results without the state controlling your choices. That is why socialism always trends towards surveillance and restriction, even if it starts politely. Because when people are free, they do things planners don't like. They move money, they buy alternatives, they trade privately, they refuse to cooperate with the plan. So the state responds with controls, capital controls, banking restrictions, anti-hoarding laws, anti-speculation rules, increased reporting, reduced privacy. The excuse is always the same: stability, fairness, safety, security. But the real motive is control, because without control, the plan collapses. And that's where the modern threat becomes real for the United States. Not because America is about to wake up one morning as a fully socialist state with total nationalization overnight, but because the cultural and political trend is moving in a direction that normalizes control. When people are taught that outcomes are rights, and that government is responsible for equalizing life itself, the demand for coercion grows. And once coercion becomes normal, freedom becomes suspicious. Now the seventh lie. Socialism fails only because of sabotage or sanctions. This is the ultimate escape hatch. Every time a socialist experiment collapses, the blame is exported. It wasn't the incentives, it wasn't the planning failures, it wasn't the destruction of property rights, it wasn't the currency manipulation, it was foreign interference, it was capitalist sabotage, it was greedy businessmen. This lie is important because it prevents learning. It protects the ideology from evidence. It makes the ideology unfalsifiable like a religion. If success proves socialism works and failure proves enemies attacked it, then socialism is never wrong. And an idea that can never be wrong is an idea that can justify anything. But when you examine collapses across history, you see internal patterns that appear regardless of external factors. Price controls, nationalization, currency manipulation, expansion of bureaucracy, punishment of private enterprise, attacks on property rights, politicized courts, control of media narratives, and the steady replacement of merit with loyalty. These patterns are not accidents. They are the mechanical result of trying to run an economy by force instead of voluntary exchange. Now, let's bring this back to the present because the title includes a specific warning, and now threaten the United States. What does that actually mean? It means the lies are being repackaged in modern branding. They aren't always called socialism. Sometimes they're called stakeholder capitalism, equity, industrial policy, comprehensive regulation, universal guarantees, wealth taxes, price stabilization, strategic sectors, climate emergency authority, housing as a human right, student debt cancellation, free everything. The labels change, the mechanics don't. Watch the sequence. First, a crisis is declared, a recession, a pandemic, a geopolitical threat, a climate emergency, a housing crisis, a healthcare crisis, a student debt crisis. Then, exceptional measures become normal. Spending explodes, regulation expands, the central bank prints or suppresses rates. People become dependent on programs. The private sector is blamed for the results of government intervention. And then the final twist. When the intervention fails, the answer is more intervention. That's the loop. It's not just economic, it's psychological, because dependency creates fear, and fear makes people trade liberty for promises. Now I want you to picture the consequences in daily life, not in ideology. What happens to housing under socialist-style policy? First, you inflate demand with subsidies and guaranteed loans while restricting supply through zoning, permit delays, environmental reviews, and regulatory costs. Prices rise. Then politicians blame landlords and speculators. Then they impose rent controls or eviction restrictions. That discourages new construction and maintenance. Supply shrinks further, quality declines, under-the-table payments grow, people with connections get apartments, people without connections suffer, a black market emerges, and the city becomes less livable, less safe, less dynamic. This isn't theoretical, it's a known chain reaction. What happens to education? When the government guarantees loans, universities raise tuition because the payer is no longer the student, it's the system. Cost becomes detached from value, degrees multiply, standards drop, bureaucracy grows. Then graduates face a market that doesn't reward the credential as much as the debt requires. Political pressure mounts for forgiveness. The debt is shifted onto taxpayers. Incentives worsen. The cycle repeats. And meanwhile, the real solution, skills, apprenticeship, competition, alternative education pathways, gets crowded out by the state-backed monopoly. What happens to healthcare? When the state or heavily regulated intermediaries distort pricing, you get administrative bloat, reduced transparency, shortages in certain services, slower innovation, and rationing by waiting time instead of price. People think price controls help them, but price controls don't reduce costs. They reduce supply. And when supply shrinks, the most vulnerable pay in time and access. What happens to currency and savings? This is the quiet disaster. If the government spends beyond production and uses monetary policy as a political tool, inflation becomes the hidden tax. Savers lose, retirees lose, wage earners lose. People who own assets often fare better, which increases inequality, the very thing socialism claims to fight. And then, the same politicians who caused the inflation blame capitalism for the inequality created by their monetary distortion. That's not just bad economics, it's a perfect political scam. Now add a modern layer, the war on cash and the push for central bank digital currencies, or simply the trend toward more traceable money. You don't need a conspiracy theory to see the incentive. A state that can track and control transactions has more power than a state that can't. If money becomes fully programmable, the state can reward behaviors and punish behaviors instantly. It can set rules on how, where, and when you spend. It can restrict purchases, It can impose negative interest to force consumption. It can freeze accounts without due process. Even if those tools are introduced with good intentions, history shows they will eventually be used when the government feels threatened by inflation, by capital flight, by dissent, by debt. And here's the brutal truth. As debt grows, the temptation to control grows. Because a heavily indebted state becomes allergic to citizens who are financially independent. Independent citizens can say no, dependent citizens can't. So what does it look like when these lies threaten America? It looks like a society where work is still done, but buying power shrinks, where people have jobs, but feel poorer, where innovation exists, but essentials become unaffordable, where politics becomes a permanent battle over redistribution instead of production, where business success is treated as suspicious, where regulations grow so dense that only giant corporations can comply, crushing small entrepreneurs, where the middle class becomes a squeezed class, too rich to receive benefits, too poor to escape the consequences, and where the cultural message shifts from build something to demand something. And once that shift happens, the economy loses its spirit. Because economies aren't just numbers, they're human energy, their ambition, their risk-taking, their trust. They're the belief that if you work hard, you can improve your life. Socialism slowly kills that belief by turning life into a political negotiation. Instead of, what can I create? People ask, what can I claim? Instead of, how can I serve? People ask, who should pay? And when that becomes normal, decline is no longer a possibility. It becomes a trajectory. Now, if you're still listening, you might be thinking, so what's the alternative? Just do nothing? Just let people suffer? No. The alternative is to stop believing in magic. To stop believing that politicians can suspend scarcity. To stop believing that central planning can outsmart human nature. The alternative is to embrace solutions that respect incentives, grow through innovation, competition, entrepreneurship, strong property rights, stable currency, limited government that enforces rules fairly instead of picking winners, safety nets that don't destroy work incentives, education that competes and evolves, and a culture that celebrates production rather than punishing it. And now I want to give you the tell that reveals when socialism is being sold to you, even when no one uses the word. Here it is. Listen for any policy that tries to solve a shortage by controlling prices instead of increasing supply. Listen for any plan that treats debt as irrelevant. Listen for any rhetoric that demonizes profit as immoral. Listen for any proposal that replaces choice with mandates for your own good. Listen for any movement that claims freedom is dangerous and control is compassion. And most importantly, listen for any promise that avoids the hard question, who pays and what happens to incentives? Because that question is the fence between prosperity and collapse. If you want a single sentence summary of everything I've said, it's this. Countries don't get ruined by bad intentions. They get ruined by bad incentives protected by good intentions. Socialism is the ideology of good intentions used to justify bad incentives. And when incentives collapse, people don't become kinder. They become desperate. When production declines, politics gets uglier, not nicer. When scarcity grows, the state doesn't become more humble. It becomes more controlling. And that is why the lies that sank countries are not just a chapter in a history book. They are a living temptation, especially for a wealthy nation that forgot what created its wealth in the first place. Now, what should you do with this? Not panic, not scream into the void, not fall into tribal hatred. The first step is intellectual clarity. Refuse slogans, demand mechanisms, ask the incentive question. The second step is personal resilience. Reduce unnecessary debt, build skills that remain valuable, diversify your sources of income over time, strengthen community ties, support local entrepreneurship, and protect the habits that make you harder to control. Independence, competence, and courage. The third step is civic maturity. Stop rewarding politicians who promise everything and explain nothing. Stop treating economics like a morality play where you can legislate prosperity. Reward policies that increase production, remove barriers to building, and protect stable money. Reward leaders who tell the truth about trade-offs even when it's unpopular. Because here's the final reality. The United States will not be taken over by socialism like a movie plot. It will be persuaded into it, piece by lies that feel compassionate. The threat is not a flag. The threat is a mindset. A mindset that says results can be demanded without costs. A mindset that says freedom is negotiable. A mindset that says power should be concentrated because the right people are in charge. That mindset has sunk nations. It can sink any nation, no matter how wealthy, no matter how powerful, no matter how exceptional it believes it is. So keep your eyes open, keep your standards high, keep your thinking sharp. And remember, the lie always sounds like kindness at the beginning. You only recognize it as a lie when you're standing in the ruins it created. If you want to protect the future, start by protecting the truth.